As you all know, Pokémon's release model has changed multiple times throughout the series' life. For the first 4 generations, each paired version was then completed with a third version, known internally at Game Freak as the upper version. That would include Pokémon Yellow, Crystal, Emerald and Platinum. These games usually functioned as a sort of complete edition of the games, you could say, maintaining the story and the general setup, but improving things that desperately needed improving. Gen 5 and 7 then received a second pair of titles, Black and White 2 and Ultra Sun and Moon, which took things in a different direction entirely and are not one-on-one improvements over the originals. They tell different stories and are much more different games than third versions were. They're essentially a new way to experience the region you traveled through just a few years prior. And then, starting with Sword and Shield, DLC was the new way to add on to a prior experience, with paid DLC now also in Scarlet and Violet, as well as recently Legends EA. What is interesting about this though is that while DLC has effectively replaced the model of old, it really tries to do and adds something completely different. Even at their most different, which I would say is Black and White 2, those later versions are essentially just retellings, occasionally retelling the story in such a way you visit new locales. But the DLC? This is not at all a revisit to Galar or Paldea. It takes you somewhere completely new. It adds an entirely new region effectively to what previously existed. And the main meat of the game is left completely untouched. No quality of life improvements, no little changes to the experience, nothing. Unless you yourself decide to say visit the Isle of Armor during your playthrough rather than afterwards. DLC may be the third version's replacement, but it doesn't remotely try to be the same thing. Which left me wondering, what if it did? What if, in an alternate timeline, the game that received additional versions had received DLC, and the games that received DLC had actually had a third version instead? What would have changed? How would it have looked? Let's try to make some sense of that. And we start with the very first third version of all, which is Pokémon Yellow. And yes, I am disregarding the fact that our Western Red and Blue are actually already new versions of the Japanese Red and Green, because that only makes things unnecessarily complicated. Well, Yellow does give Kanto a new coat of paint in terms of sprites for both overworld objects as well as Pokémon. That is of course not the main selling point of the game. Instead, this is Pokémon Red and Blue Anime Edition. And so, I think it is only sensible that if that is the philosophy behind Yellow's release, then in that case, if it were to be DLC instead, so a pure addition to base Red and Blue, rather than a retelling, it would only be right if that DLC was anime focused as well. This was peak Pokemania, you have to cash in on that. So while we can't touch the base experience at all, like the real Yellow did, adding Pikachu as a starter and Jessie and James as characters, we instead need to add a new something to base Kanto. And what else would be a better pick than the Orange Islands? Think about it. It's anime exclusive, so automatically an anime tie-in. The Orange Island saga debuted in the West in the same year as Pokémon Yellow, 1999, and it would be the perfect excuse to add anime exclusive characters to the game. Jessie, James, Meowth could appear here, we could run into Ash, seeing as we are now no longer really playing as him, and to add some true meat to the game, we could take on the 5 Orange Islands gym leaders. It would essentially just add a smaller bonus Kanto onto the pre-existing Kanto, which is what the DLC does in its most basic form. And don't forget, the Sevi Islands already show us that when Game Freak felt compelled to add the Kanto, they went with islands. So if you ask me, keeping the anime tie-in in mind, an Orange Islands themed DLC would by far have been the most likely. But now we go from one of the easier ones, I would say, Yellow, to probably the hardest of them all, Crystal. Gold and Silver are already such packed games that it is incredibly difficult to think what could possibly be added onto that without touching the base experience, as Pokémon DLC doesn't do that. It was very much just that, which the real Pokémon Crystal did though, adding animated sprites, small quality of life additions, and an entire Suicune arc, which we can't use, because if it were DLC, you would have already caught Suicune in Gold and Silver. It also doesn't bode well for a potential DLC storyline focusing on USUM, seeing as his whole thing is hunting Suicune. But what if he were to hunt Celebi instead? After all, the GS Ball and a catchable Celebi are effectively already DLC in Pokémon Crystal, only available through a Japanese event and later Virtual Console. It is way too barren in its real life form to ever replace an actual purchasable DLC, but maybe we can fix that. You see, while the anime never delivers on it, it sets up a grand arc for the GS Ball, one we could say in this alternate timeline actually is the focus of this DLC. And since the GS Ball was actually introduced in the Orange Islands, it could even tie into the DLC for Red and Blue that way. And just like later actual DLC would do, there is also potential for a little something for the battle-focused players among us. It was Crystal that introduced the Battle Tower to the series, and while in the modern day, selling the Battle Tower as DLC would probably not go over too well, I feel like if that was a new introduction and a part of the aforementioned GS Ball focused DLC, that it would be a very big addition to really add some meat to the DLC pass, I guess it would then be. Definitely not as cool as what Red and Blue got added on, I think, but hey, it's at least better than the cynical answer, which is that the entirety of Kanto would probably have been DLC in the modern era. Next is probably one of the easiest of all, Emerald. Because of course, a would-be DLC for Ruby and Sapphire based on what we know from real-life Emerald has to be centered all around the battle frontier. While the actual in-game version is probably not worth the admission price of DLC all by itself, it doesn't need too much expansion to reach it, and the potential to build this out more is definitely there. Hell, if the anime can make an entire season out of it, then the games can make a DLC, I would wager. Some additional bonuses that would be lifted straight from Emerald as well are the option to receive the Johto starters, which would probably now be tied to the battle frontier rather than the Dex, Gym Leader rebattles, a new device to include the calling of trainers since we can't exactly change the Pokegear like Emerald did, and even the option, for the very first time, to include Pokemon that were not originally in the game, as base Ruby and Sapphire have plenty of old Pokemon that were initially unavailable. This was not yet an option for the first two gens, as basically all Pokemon were available in both games, save for some special ones, but Ruby and Sapphire have a mini Dex hit going on, which means that even mundane names like Pidgey and Mareep could now make their grand return for the small price of like 20 to 30 bucks. Sounds unappealing when you say it like that, but I think that if a modern Pokemon game received a Battle Frontier expansion, people would love it. Once again, we go from an easy one to a very tricky one, which is, spoiler alert, a pattern all throughout this video really. Platinum's additions are immense. It makes Gen 4 so much better than what Diamond and Pearl were, through the power of quality of life improvements, a much better Dex, and some very cool additional story content. All of which cannot be a part of the DLC, because remember, we cannot alter the base game, just like modern Pokemon DLC doesn't, and we cannot add the Distortion world because base Diamond and Pearl already let you catch a Giratina, so it cannot be the focus here again. Well, unless you add a second one, but I don't think we should be willing to break canon like that. We can't even go back to one of the DLC's most basic functions, more Pokemon, since really all Diamond and Pearl were still missing was past special Pokemon like starters and legendaries. Everything else was already available between the two games. However, just like in Gen 2, we are once again being saved by the great power of events. Because while Shaymin, Darkrai and Arceus could be brought over to Diamond and Pearl, they didn't exist in the games. Their events were exclusive to Platinum. And so, those three events could form the foundation of a potential Sinnoh DLC, with an additional arc included with Charon and the development of the new Rotom forms. Once again, just like with Celebi, the three events would have to be expanded a bit, but seeing as they are already quite story heavy as far as one-off events go, I don't think that should be too hard. Add some more quest elements to Darkrai's story, make Seabreak Path an actual route, and add some more mystique and potentially even more requirements to the use of the Azure Flute, and you're already well on your way to a decent expansion. The Regis could also be thrown in, as Platinum did add them as extra legendaries, but since they are tied into Regigigas, who you could already catch in Diamond and Pearl, it would lose a lot of what makes that questline worth it. But maybe it can be rewritten in reverse, so that you need the base game's Regigigas in order to find the other three. The roaming legendary birds from Platinum can easily be thrown in as a bonus as is though. Oh, and did I mention that Platinum also has a Battle Frontier? I wouldn't make it the focus of the DLC again, but it should surely be included, rounding out a pretty chunky expansion if I say so myself. Like I said before, we go from a trickier one to an easy one next, with Gen 5 and potential DLC for Black and White. Now, based on how we currently know Pokemon DLC operates, the main focus of these games, the fact they are sequels, wouldn't be able to be kept the same as DLC. However, as part of this revisit, Black and White 2 also added a lot of new areas to the region, which make for the perfect Unova answer to areas like the Isle of Armor or Kitakami. Aspertia City, Verbank City and Pokestar Studios, Reversal Mountain, Lantamass Town, Humalau City and all the routes surrounding them. It makes for the perfect DLC playground. Add on to that a pretty easy to lift storyline with a new friend in the form of you and a new villain in Chorus, as well as 3 more gym leaders to challenge, and it all basically creates itself. Black and White 2 also already added a whole bunch of old Pokémon to the game, which the original title severely lacked, including legendaries to collect in the post-game, and I don't think there has ever been an area in Pokémon that felt so DLC coded as the Pokémon World Tournament. I mean, this is fan service out the wazoo. So many Pokémon fans would buy something like this in a heartbeat nowadays. In terms of new Pokémon, Black and White 2 kinda follows the train of thought we saw in Sinnoh. Keldeo, Meloetta and Genesect weren't introduced until Black and White 2, so slot those in. The forces of nature received new forms which weren't actually available in Black and White 2, but now they are, and the storyline with Team Plasma could still lead to the creation of Kyurem's new forms pretty easily. While talking about what Pokemon Z, a potential third version of X and Y, could, maybe should have been, is super interesting, I don't think it really suits the topic for today, so instead we move on to Gen 7 and Ultra Sun and Moon. This is a bit of a tricky one, because on one hand, these games do a lot of things the DLC would later end up doing, like expanding the Pokédex, including brand new Pokémon with several new Ultra Beasts, an entirely new post-game storyline with episode Rainbow Rocket, new locations in Ultra Space, as well as several more smaller things like the Battle Agency, Mantine Surfing, the hunt for old legendaries, and additional Z Crystals and Megastones. That's a very solid foundation for a DLC pack right there. But on the other hand, many changes the Ultra games made were focused on changing the story, all of which are elements we cannot lift over due to the DLC never touching the base game. So while we have a strong foundation, I don't think there is enough yet to warrant this standing on its own. It's not as strong as what our Black and White pack offered, for example. One solution could be to, well, expand the expansion. Make the Rainbow Rocket storyline much bigger, add more visitable worlds, add more story content to the new Ultra Beasts rather than what the final games end up doing, etc. However, I do think we also need a bit of what Scarlet and Violet did, which is include more content with the characters players really started to vibe with, like Gladion and Lily, which is easier said than done, since Lily leaves at the end of Sun and Moon, while Gladion is the new president of the Ether Foundation. In that role, writing in Gladion shouldn't be too hard. Lily though would have to make a big return in order to play a new role in the story, which could be done using the fact Lusamine has joined her and may have some role to play in stopping Team Rainbow Rocket, seeing as Faba is involved, or help with the Ultra Space explorations. It's definitely on the lighter side of our DLC pack so far, but I think it's just enough to warrant its existence. It's about comparable to the DLC of, say, Legends EA, for example. And with that, we have successfully replaced every single additional version with DLC. But the reverse is yet to be done. What if Sword and Shield never expanded beyond Galar's initial borders and instead remixed the base game just like the third versions of old would do? Well, maybe this is a little too ambitious for a third version, but by far the biggest difference between the base game of Sword and Shield and the DLC are the routes. All DLC areas are the same style as the wild area. There are no conventional routes whatsoever, and as such it does feel, if it was feasible within the time, which I would wager it would probably be, by far the most likely change to warrant fans to buy the same game another time was to change every route in Galar to be wild area style. That may sound a little ambitious, but if you keep in mind that in the same time frame they also developed the entire Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra, I don't think it is impossible whatsoever to instead have altered the base region. Furthermore, I think it's very likely an additional storyline for at the very least Calyrex would have been added, seeing as it is very much tied into its own lore, whereas Cupfu is more of a standalone Pokemon that could just be added as a gift or whatever. I also suspect we would have seen some reshuffling of the gym leaders, potentially as a sort of sequel or simply to keep things fresh. But with such a big focus on gym battles in Galar, plus the fact that in total Sword and Shield has 12 gym leaders throughout the course of the game, it would be a huge waste not to reshuffle that. While I wouldn't necessarily expect the graphics to receive a great overhaul, I do also think the main story would be altered, similar to Ultra Sun and Moon, except now hopefully for the better. After all, I can't imagine Game Freak didn't realize Rose as a villain, and his master plan is one of the weakest aspects of Sword and Shield, so I think that would definitely be getting a second look. And But for some smaller stuff, I picture some of the DLC's returning Pokemon would now be added to Galar, a new way would be found to include a legendary hunt again, and I think Peony could still have an appearance, seeing as he is directly tied to Rose, but I can't say I'm sure whether Mustard, Clara and Avery would have also survived. I'd wager they wouldn't. I do think it's possible Sonya's role would be expanded, seeing as her role in the DLC of Sword and Shield seems like a direct response to her popularity, so maybe she would now properly be Galar's professor, right from the start of the game. Laying it all out like that, it does sound like a revised Sword and Shield has real potential to salvage an often criticized generation somewhat, but at the same time I think this crafting also shows that the switch to DLC was a good call. You have to remember that a potential Pokemon Eternal Sword and Eternal Shield would have cost full price again, for what is largely the same content except with some new elements added on. Then again, I am not ashamed to admit I strongly prefer DLC over third versions, simply because I prefer expanding my existing playthrough rather than starting all over again, so I'm not exactly neutral in that discussion. Anyway, let's continue with Scarlet and Violet, which may be one of the few Pokemon games to have never received an additional version, but definitely needed one the most, probably alongside Diamond and Pearl. Because while the DLC never improved the performance, a third version like Pokemon Magenta or whatever definitely would have, and we can see now with the Switch 2 how much of a difference that would have made. It could have changed the entire perception of this generation. As for additional content, I'm thinking it's mostly story-based this time, effectively merging the past and future storylines of Scarlet and Violet by, for example, including both professors and a shared Area Zero. An expanded Area Zero could also easily lead to the inclusion of Terrapagos, which could bring its stellar mechanic along to really shake things up, as well as the 4 Paradox Legendaries, as seen in the DLC, so Walking Wake, Iron Leaves, those 2 trios. In that sense, the hidden treasure of Area Zero could still be the focus of this third version, it just wouldn't be explored in Kitakami and the Blueberry Academy, but rather through story changes in Paldea. For that reason though, I don't think Ogerpan, the Loyal Free and the new Kitakamian forms, so to speak, have a chance of making the cut here, but there's no reason Archaludon wouldn't appear, and Petchuran does feel a little easier to still appear as an event. As well, it is strongly tied to Misui Town, I don't see a reason why it couldn't cause the same mayhem when imported to Paldea. And of course, this third version would include all kinds of returning old Pokemon, and perhaps the game would encourage you to do things in a different order this time, although I don't know if the level scaling would also be changed. I think that in order to know that, we first need to know what future games will do. And last, and well, kinda least, because I'm not a huge fan of this DLC, we have Legend ZA. And this is really the only content in this entire video that probably could have been in the base game already, seeing as I really doubt they made this entire DLC only in the few months after the game was done, although that would explain some of its shortcomings. Either way, I think this is a really tricky game to tackle, because while this is the only DLC that doesn't leave familiar ground and introduce new areas, it also kinda does, and not in a way that I can see ever making an impact on the base game. Like, you could include Corinna in the base game, that's not too hard, same with all the new Mega Evolutions and the newly added Legendaries to hunt, but the core part of it, Ansha, Hoopa and the hyperspace mechanics, wouldn't really work as an additional storyline of the base game, I don't think, despite being set in the same locale. And yet, I don't really see obvious shortcomings in base Legend ZA that need to be addressed. All I can think of is that a second version of Legend ZA, let's call it a Switch 2 version that actually adds new content, for lack of a better term, is to add areas outside of Lumiose City. Nothing major, just small parts of the routes. Or perhaps some more areas akin to Lysander Labs and the sewers, like perhaps the Catacombs of Paris or something else. Because the core idea of Legend ZA is honestly pretty well rounded. Quality aside, I don't think the game left a single stone in Lumiose City unturned, and its story, while formulaic, doesn't really have glaring weaknesses that have to be fixed either. All that comes to mind is perhaps a sort of USUM-esque storyline that turns the hunt for Yveltal and Xerneas into, well, an actual hunt, rather than the sorry excuse for one the actual game has. But yeah, it shouldn't really be a surprise that an additional version for a singular game doesn't work that well, especially seeing as the DLC already struggled to add something of true value. But how would you tackle either new DLC or versions for these games? And would you play my answers? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing. And if you really want to support me, you can now become a channel member to get all kinds of fun perks and help me keep bringing these videos to your doorstep every week. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.